All right. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. We've got 4 sessions that we're doing, and I'm squeezing 6 from the curriculum down into that 4. So we have a lot to get through this evening. We'll be watching more videos this week and next week, and a little less conversation. And then that last week, we'll have a little more time to kind of talk and assess and sum up and see what our personal next steps are going to be. So, but let's go ahead and get cranking tonight. So any prayers we want to share this evening that we can carry with you this week? Brother Charles. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for this gathering this evening. We pray for our few friends who are away tonight and will rejoin us next time. God, we pray you bless this time, help us to see you and to hear you and to learn a little bit about how we might engage this world that gives us such a divided and conflictual picture of what it means to be human when we know you created us for better than that. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. And hello, Brother Charles. Good to have you with us. All right, we are going to go ahead and jump in here. And before we do this, I'll just tell you, if you have not signed in and registered and got into the workbook, there was a little inventory for tonight between hope and humility. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little assignment about what this is going to be. I will go ahead and put in the chat something for you to look at that we're going to use here shortly. So if you haven't done it already and gotten your scores, this is a way for you to get a rough estimate for this evening. There we go, in the chat. So you can take a look at that as we watch this first video. And here we go, hope and humility. Share screen. All right, and I'm gonna just share with you now that I'm in a hotel room, and I'm really hoping all the technology works for the duration.
Good evening there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So here we go.
We've been talking about the effects of this big sword. So, David, why is humility so important for Christian politics?
So, if you want to talk about the things that are really dividing America right now, let's talk about the legacy of American slavery and fixing that. If you want to talk about abortion rights, or if you want to talk about how do you deal with Vladimir Putin, or how do you deal with China and Taiwan, these are complicated matters. Yeah. They're incredibly complicated. Not one of us is an expert in any of them, much less all of them. And so humility is just a necessary recognition of the reality of complexity. So, when I got back from Iraq and I was hip deep in this Iraqi civil war and the tangled web of Middle East violence, one of the fastest ways I knew that I was interacting with somebody who didn't know what they were talking about is when they would say, well, I know how to fix it, right?
Yeah.
Now, if they said, this is really difficult, here's my best idea, yeah, I'm listening to that. But this sort of authoritative declaration of you know exactly what to do, you're immediately broadcasting that you haven't really looked at it in all of its richness and complexity. And we're in a world right now where we're full of people who have absolute definite ideas about virtually every major issue under the sun. And it's just not recognizing reality. I think humility is the proper recognition of reality.
Russell, why do you think that's so hard for Christians in politics? What's going on that we, as Christians, we're having such a hard time walking humbly?
Well, it's difficult first because we're sinners.
Yeah, that's true.
So
I forgot about that.
Humility is something we're always going to be grappling with. But secondly, I think it's hard, particularly for Christians, because sometimes people feel as though humility is a lack of conviction. And so having certainty on everything is a sign of faithfulness or truth. And so that tends to cause people to become scared sometimes when they think, well, I don't know exactly how to fix.
Right. So they have to gin up the sense of conviction that's
so
not actually based in true knowledge.
Yes. And usually what happens is you kind of outsource your thinking to somebody or to some voices who say, it's easy. All you do is this. And that's a very alluring temptation for most of us.
And I get it. I totally get it. When a new and complicated thing arises and it's on a hot button issue, you crave certainty. It's very human to want to do this. But one of the things that I urge people to do is anytime you hear a new idea or a new thought or a new concept, learn about the idea from the idea's proponents before you race to learn about it from its opponents. Look at yourself like you're a juror. A juror in a criminal case or a civil case hears from the prosecution and then hears from the defense and decides only after they've heard each side do their best to persuade. And even then, good jurors sometimes end their time on jury duty going, I did my best, but I wasn't positive. And that is okay to say as a Christian. I'm doing my best, but I'm not sure.
And I would take that just a little bit further to say, imagine yourself in the position of the person who holds that viewpoint, because every viewpoint makes sense to the people who hold it.
Well, I think that's so valuable, and that seems to be one way we can all walk humbly. Let's talk about hope.
Okay.
Why do we need to grow our hope if we're going to have a healthy Christian politics? Russell, why is hope so important?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to say what hope is.
Okay.
The Bible says you hope for what you do not see and you long for it. So you're trusting God to get you there. Hope's important in this arena because if you're hopeless, then you end up either just giving up or you end up saying, well, what does it matter, because it's all just going to fall apart anyway. There has to be some goal at the end of this that we have to move toward.
Let me pull back into the example of Jesus for a moment, okay? You also have to ask, what are you hoping for? Okay, so Jesus, who was on the cross and had the power to get himself off the cross, right? He had the power to smite the people who were unjustly crucifying him. So what does he do in his dying moments before his, of course, before his resurrection? He says, forgive them, they know not what they do. Well, some of the hope there is embodied in what is the state of their souls. It's removing it above and beyond the immediate circumstance. He didn't say that to them in the hope that they would say, we're crucifying the wrong guy. We're going to pull him off the cross, right? So we have to center our hope in the right thing. And that's really critical in these political discussions. What we often do is we end up centering our hope in a certain ideology prevailing.
That's right.
And so we have to right order our hope. What is our hope ordered towards? And our hope is very much rightly ordered to what is the condition of expressing hope for the salvation of other people, of the discipling of other people. And when you're talking about that as a hope, it really does begin to alter maybe some of your priorities when you're talking about ideological combat or you're talking about political combat. And then the other thing is, if you're talking about the fate of Christianity, which is often discussed, well, where are you locating your hope for the fate of Christianity? Are you locating your hope in the sovereignty of God or the sovereignty of a political party or a politician? So I know of quite a few people who hope and have a lot of hope, but often in the wrong thing.
I love that because this is so much about this big shift that we're talking about from the what of ideology, of party, of policy, to the how of spiritual values, of relationship, of spiritual practices. And this shift from our hope, not on an ideology prevailing, but actually our hope in Jesus and what he's doing in the kingdom at the level of the Spirit.
First, I'd like to take us back to where David just had us at the cross. If you think about these two different kinds of hope, you have two criminals on either side of Jesus. The one is saying, if you're the Christ, get us out of here.
That's right. The what? Well, he's focused on the what, yes.
Just end this. And the one who's redeemed says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. There's a sense of need for grace and a sense of something that's beyond just the immediate circumstance.
That's right.
And so that's often I want to have the first criminal's kind of hope.
That's right.
But what do we immediately
what of an
get?
outcome that we want,
Yeah.
Lovely. Well, here we have it. We need to grow all of our humility and our hope. So let's get going. We've talked about the shift to spiritual values, and we're going to focus especially on two spiritual values, that of humility and that of hope. Why are these so important? Well, it's because Jesus really made them very important as part of his big shift with his disciples. So let's recall what the political scene was like in Jesus' day. The Romans have invaded Israel. They're imposing oppressive taxes through the tax collectors, and this is not popular with many Jews, especially the opposed the Roman camp. At this point, the energy, excitement is building that Jesus is going to come through and really kick the Romans out. He's going to be the Messiah, which is the political expectation that he will defeat the Romans militarily, politically. And in this moment, when this energy and excitement, this hope is actually building, two disciples, James and John, approach Jesus with this request saying, we want you to do whatever we ask of you when you come into your glory. Glory is really code for victory, for a political military victory of Jesus against the Romans. And what James and John want is, hey, when you come into your glory, give us the top posts. They're like the political campaign workers who are betting when their candidate wins, they get the top positions. Now notice that Jesus does not squash their hopes. He doesn't say you're wrong to hope for glory and to participate in glory. He wants hopeful disciples. But notice what he says. He says to James and John, you do not know what you're asking for. You do not know. That's the statement to some disciple who needs to grow in humility. And that's the invitation for us, to grow both our hope and our humility. Surveys can reveal a great deal about where we are politically. For instance, there's a New York Times poll where all you have to do is answer one question, and that question is, what's your zip code? And out of that, the survey can spit out with pretty high degree of accuracy what is the likelihood of what your politics are, or at least the politics of most of your neighbors. Now that's about the politics of what, because that reveals what party that you're most likely affiliated with. If we're doing this big shift from the what to the how, we need a different kind of survey. We need a survey that measures something about the how. And remember, the big shift is taking us from ideology and party to spiritual values. So now we're going to ask you to take a survey on the spiritual values of hope and humility. When you complete the online survey, you'll get a sense of measurement of where you are on hope and humility. There will be one final button that reveals a political type that comes with that profile in this Jesus How framework. Don't click that final button quite yet. We'll prompt you for when to do that.
All right, take a second there. Okay, great. So hopefully you looked at the questions in the chat. Welcome, Lola. Lola may not see those in the chat since she just got with us. I will stick them in there. or else you registered and looked at the survey. Remember we learned last week that you can't just click into it. You got to register for free, and then you can get into the workbook. And that's where this is. All right. So we need you to have a number for this next thing. If you did the quiz or the inventory, you've got a number. It's going to be somewhere between 1 and 25 or so for two things, for hope and for humility. And so that's what the quick questions there in the chat have you do. What is your level of hopefulness toward politics as being capable of attaining positive ends? From 1 to 25, with your hopefulness being really low at 1 and super high at 25. The other one, your level of humility with regard to your positions on prominent political issues. Same thing. If your level of humility is really low, you would put it at 1. If your level of humility is really high, you'd put that at 25. All right. So now we've done that, we're going to watch a short video where he talks about this quadrant. As a tool for looking at where we fall kind of in the spectrum here.
That button that reveals your political profile. When you do so, you'll get one of 4 profiles. One is the profile of the combatant. The combatant is the person who is actually low in humility because they think they're right and everybody else is wrong, or at least their opponent is wrong. But they're high in hope because they think they can win. That's why they're fighting. The next profile is the exact opposite of the combatant. It's the exhausted. The exhausted is actually high in humility. They don't think they have all the answers, but they're low in hope. They're ready to give up. Now, the third profile is the profile of the cynic, which is low in both. They're low in humility because they think they know better than everyone else, and they're also low in hope because they think what they know better than anybody else is that everything is hopeless, so they're standing back. And then the final profile, the one that we're aspiring towards, is the disciple of Jesus that is high in both humility and hope. You can think of the profiles as having different physical postures. The combatant has the fists up, ready to fight the opponent. The exhausted has slumped shoulders and maybe the head in the hands in weariness. The cynic is somebody who is going to fold their arms and lean back because they know better and they know it's hopeless. The disciple is the one who has hands open to receive and learn and is leaning forward into the world and into Jesus. As your guide through this course, let me encourage you, this survey is just a snapshot of where you are right now. The great thing about the hope and humility quadrant is that everyone can find their place on there and everyone has a pathway for growth. It's not fixed. It's not like you're stuck there forever. In fact, this quadrant gives you a pathway for growth. And the Bible is full of examples of people who have followed one of these pathways. For example, there's Elijah and Jonah, who I would say start out as combatants and then go through all of the quadrants. They go to exhausted, and then they finally go to disciple. And then there's Thomas, who is the classic example of somebody who starts out as cynic. And Jesus is inviting him to go on the path to being his disciple. Now that you know your political profile, we want to invite you to actually share that with others. In your small group, share with one another what came up for you, both in the results and especially how do you feel about those results.
All right. So we want to take just a few minutes here and talk about this a little bit. We'd love to hear from you what you think of this quadrant and kind of looking at our politics and how we deal with them through the lens of that those two characteristics, our hope and our humility. So somebody who found yourself in this quadrant, you can share with us here in a second. I'll share mine first. When I did it, I got 14 in both, which put me right, like the middle of the quadrant is 15 and 15. I am a cynic by one on both scales, which I think kind of fits me around my perception of secular politics. So who else had a number or found yourself, and even if you just looked at the quadrants and you could just identify yourself, who found yourself in there somewhere?
Well, I found myself exhausted.
Mm, mm-hmm.
I think
Did that
that
feel right?
first
Did that feel right?
question was that first question. I scored a 2. So I
Okay.
think that puts me in the exhausted
Yeah.
category.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Skip.
Yeah.
Who else found it? Denise, you unmuted. You find yourself?
Well, actually, my scores kind of surprised me, but I had a 17 and an 18. So it kind of surprised me, but that's where I ended up. So
Yeah. So that's is that the disciple quadrant?
yeah.
Yeah. Good. All right. I'm just going to keep a little tally here, see where we end up. So we've got 3 of the 4 covered in these first 3 already. So who else would found yourself in a particular place here?
Well, I thought I was a 15 on hope and a 13 on humility, and I'm not sure where that puts me.
All right. Well, let me do this real quick. I drew up a whiteboard just so we could have a picture to look at while we're talking about this. So let's see if it'll show it to us where to go.
Because if it's 1 to 25, then 12 and a half would be dead center, right?
15. Well, actually, 15 is the middle. You're right. There we go. Here's the picture. All right. Let's get that out of there. All right. So you said what were your 2 numbers?
15 on hope and 13 on humility.
Okay, hope's on the. I forgot to put the hope and humility in here. All right. I think
Hope's on the vertical.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So sorry, same again. So you said 17.
15 on hope,
Okay.
13 on humility.
13 on humility. All right. So you're between cynic and combatant according to their thing. My 25 was a guess when I said 21 to 25. So
Okay.
all right. Okay, who else? Just looking at the 4. Is anybody else, even if you didn't do the numbers exactly, where would you find yourself?
Probably be between combatant and cynic.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
That gives us, so we've covered all 4 now. That's good. All right. So what do you think? I'll get us out of this real quick. Close whiteboard. Let's see. Brother Charles, you gonna weigh in? Where'd you find yourself?
Disciple.
Disciple. All right. Excellent. Okay. So how this idea, these 4 categories, I mean, how do you see them as maybe being helpful in thinking about where we're at and in how we engage politics and in the world around us? Is it helpful for you to think of yourself in one of those spaces and where you want to be as opposed to where you are, and how hope or the lack of it plays into the way you look at the world around you, or your humility about how much, for me, think about how well I know this stuff, right? And whether whether I'm able to understand that I don't know everything, or I know this so well nobody can possibly challenge my position, right? What do you think? How helpful is this?
The history of politics in the church go way back. It's not a new phenomenon. It's only that having the access to hear the difference is more available. But the political view, I think Jesus started the political view in the last week's lesson when he talked about he got a tax collector and a zealot. Politics, they represent the money and the governance of it and the laws that govern it. Politics, right? And so the only thing different now is that we have access to the different views. Everybody can give their own opinion, right?
Yeah. If politics have to do with how people interact with each other and work together or not with each other, I think it's interesting to think of it not in terms of right or left, red or blue, Republican or Democrat, liberal, conservative, but if we change, and this is what they're talking about with us in this series, is that is the big sort that we've put ourselves into in this country, between those political opposites, moving to the big shift where we rather than seeing ourselves only on that right left spectrum, we see ourselves on a spectrum that Jesus wants us to see ourselves on. That's not red or blue, it's hope and humility. How high is your hope? How high is your humility? Or how low is it? And that is what they're suggesting in this series. That's the spectrum that we need to be thinking about ourselves on in terms of how we relate to each other and to the world around us. So that's our challenge in this series, I think, to look at this way. All right. Like I said, we got to move pretty quickly this evening. So I'm going to move us on to the next thing here. Hopefully, there it is. All right, our need for humility. Let me this again.
So, I hope that exercise was helpful and maybe perhaps you learned something about yourself. One of the things I've learned about myself is that I am dispositionally more combative. And this might come as a surprise to some people who follow fights on Twitter, but I did spend more than 20 years as a litigator. My life was in courtroom combat, which is thankfully a far cry from real combat, but my life was spent in the battle of ideas. And I was a participant and am a participant in the battle of ideas. A big focus of my life was and is trying to persuade people to a particular point of view and to a particular perspective. I am predisposed to the combatant mindset. And so I've had to work on that, on tempering the hard edges of that. There are other people who are much more predisposed to kindness, more predisposed to humility. And sometimes they actually have to work on pulling themselves out of that shell and actually engaging for the sake of justice. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes recognizing that a strength can lead to a weakness is a really important aspect of understanding our engagement, not just in the public square, but in life. When I think about my combativeness, my mind goes back to law school. There was a lot of contention on campus, booing, hissing, shouting down, cancel culture before anybody knew what cancel culture was. It was extremely contentious. And there were many times I jumped into that contention with both feet. Now, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with engaging in the contest of ideas. But the way that I did it, sometimes, especially in specific classes, I got carried away. There is absolutely no question, and I'm kind of haunted by a story a friend of mine told from several years ago, where he met with a classmate of ours, and he was talking about, keeping up with other folks and what they'd done, and he mentioned my name. And the first response at the mention of my name was that I was a jerk, except he used more colorful language. And when he told me that, I remembered where I spent most of my time around that classmate. It was in a particular class. And I can remember going all the way back to 1993, walking out of that class and sometimes asking God for forgiveness for the way that I'd behaved. But you know what I never did? I never asked anyone in the class for forgiveness for the way that I behaved. Their entire interaction with me was being extremely combative, extremely aggressive, and sometimes really angry. And I think about that often, and that tendency in me to engage in an extremely aggressive way has come up throughout my life. And one of the things that I've had to learn is, one, that's in me, and I need to understand that and deal with that. And number two, is I shouldn't just apologize and ask God for forgiveness. I need to ask the people that I have reacted against so strongly for forgiveness as well. So we'll learn more about the combatant in the next session, but I want to talk a bit more about humility. Humility at its basis is the recognition that we're inescapably flawed, and that sometimes, even in the areas where we feel most confident, we might be wrong. And so it's just this understanding that says, I could be wrong about any given issue, and also that I know I am wrong about some things. I just don't necessarily know what they are yet. Because hopefully if you already know you're wrong, you're correcting yourself. But to walk into the public square and to say, look, I'm offering this as my best understanding of the issue. This is my best argument based on the knowledge that I have. But also, I know I could be wrong. And in some sense, I know that I am wrong. It just hasn't been pointed out to me, or I haven't understood it yet. Recognizing complexity is a key to humility. There are many issues in the United States that are unbelievably complex. And if somebody is walking in and they're saying, A, B, C, and D is the answer to this unbelievably complex issue, you should be immediately on your guard. That's not to say that people shouldn't have convictions or ideas. Existential humility is not the same thing as moral relativism, and that we need to be really clear about that. The moment when I began to really much more fully understand that call on my life and how I had failed in that call really came in the aftermath of my Iraq deployment, where I had been so confident in my partisanship. I had been so confident in the rightness of my cause that, quite frankly, I had begun to lose the ability to see the other side. I'd begun to lose the ability to understand their perspective. And it was that experience in Iraq, both the very personal experience of being bonded as brothers with people from every conceivable different background, political, religiously, etc., and also the experience of coming home and seeing how America was polarizing exactly at the time I had started to depolarize. I began to see things differently. And so I became much more interested in trying to learn where I'd been wrong than just single-mindedly convincing everybody that I was so right. And now, keep in mind, my job at that time is I'm a litigator, so my job is to convince a jury or convince a judge. My profession was cutting against my newfound instinct and inclination towards humility. And I'll be honest, I'm still reconciling those competing forces. So when I think of how do we manifest humility concretely, the verse that comes to mind is Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly. It is to love kindness, or love mercy in some translations, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. And as a practical matter, ideally what I try to do is reverse the order in my interaction with individuals. I try to walk in humbly with kindness in the pursuit of justice. Now, any one of those three values is optional. But as a practical matter, when you enter into a conversation with somebody on the other side of an issue, I think it's very good to begin by listening. It's very good to begin by showing genuine affection for people or a willingness to meet and to get to know people. So let me give you an example of learning from somebody who's very, very different from me. The person that I spent the most time with in Iraq, the person who actually reached out to me as a friend first when I arrived in Iraq, could not be more different from me on so many ways. I'm a white, evangelical, longtime conservative, at that time, partisan Republican. He is a Mexican-American agnostic, former Catholic, former Mormon, left-wing original supporter of Barack Obama, okay? So we're really different. We're really different. And I can honestly say, I don't think he persuaded me to change any of my political positions. I don't think I persuaded him to change his political positions, but I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about the immigrant experience in the United States. I learned about what it was like for him to encounter gross racism in Wisconsin when he was growing up. I learned sort of the heart of why so many people looked at Barack Obama and saw a symbol of hope. I was in constant learning mode. Now, that didn't mean that I suddenly supported Barack Obama. It didn't mean that I was any less evangelical or anything like that. But I learned so much from him and continue to learn from him and from relationships with people I disagree with. And politics for us was never the main thing. As important as it is, as much as justice matters, it was never the main thing. And so to this day, he's one of my most treasured friends, as different as we are. And even though he did not make me progressive, and he didn't win me over to agnosticism, not that he even really tried, it is still a precious friendship to me, and he is a person whom I respect and have learned from a great deal. This is a command to how to live the way God wants us to live, sometimes even in the face of hatred and adversity. There are people in this country, there are people in your community, there are people in your church who have exhibited kindness, who have walked humbly, and they have faced cruelty. And how they saw that and how they overcame that and continue to be kind and continue to be humble, I think is an incredibly important lesson for all of us.
Okay, so there's the one about humility. So we're going to jump right into the one about hope, and then we're going to talk a little bit after that. So pull this one up. Share.
When I was about 12 years old, I went to see my pastor, who I respected greatly, and said, I think maybe the Lord's calling me to ministry. And he said, okay, well, you're going to preach Sunday night at a youth service. And I was horrified. I said, I don't mean now. God's not calling me to preach now. And he said, well, I'm going to show you how to do it. But he was wise enough to know that it would be a really good experience for me. And I mean, I went up and preached for 8 minutes, went into the little bathroom on the side of the baptistry and threw up beforehand because I was so nervous, went back into that bathroom and threw up again after because I had been so nervous. But after that, the entire congregation came up and one by one gave these words of encouragement that I think really changed the trajectory of my life. I drifted away from a call to ministry and went into politics, was working in the political arena, served starting as an intern and then on up to communications director for a United States congressman, running communications on a congressional campaign. My wife and I started dating on the campaign trail. She would go with me to county fairs or other places where I would be speaking for my congressman, organizing people for my congressman. I served in that way, but the calling to ministry persisted. And sure enough, later in life, I was in a position where I had to be thoroughly familiar both with the world of the church and with the world of politics. I ended up being the president of the public policy agency of my denomination, the ERLC. And so I would have to be working every day, preaching and teaching the Bible, and working with presidents and members of Congress and governors on issues that mattered to religious people and to the outside world. And so working on both communicating to church people why we ought to love our neighbor when it comes to foster care, and working on ending concentration camps for Uyghur people in China. I mean, all of that in one day. And I can see that all of these little aspects that I never saw how they might come together actually did. I think exhaustion comes about the same way it does in the physical world. You do something, you press at something, and all your energy is expended. I've found over the past several years, having especially a church that is so divided on these questions, and also that makes these questions ultimate, it has left, at least for me, sometimes with a sense of what good does it do to even engage with this. And a lot of times when you're in the middle of a whirlwind of constant conflict, there are some people who actually like that. They're enlivened by that. I'm not someone like that. I find myself, when I'm talking to someone who's been around for a long time or someone who's an expert in some area of history or sociology, I'll find myself asking, have things always been this crazy? Is this just life and I'm just noticing it? Or are we in a really unique time? And so far, to the person, they have said, this is a unique time. There's something very different about this moment that we're in right now. The exhausted person often starts to wonder, am I the one who is out of step and out of touch because I can't see what a lot of people around me seem to see? Of the categories that we're dealing with in this time together, I most identify with the exhausted. And I think that's because I'm a disappointed idealist, a broken-hearted idealist. And I think when that happens, there ultimately can be a sense of being overwhelmed. A key reason why I think people move into the exhausted phase is that anyone can endure almost anything for a little while. So if someone thinks I'm pressing through this conflict or craziness or whatever is happening for a little while, they can do it. It's when a person starts to think, oh, this is now the new normal, that a person can be overwhelmed by that. One of the reasons idealists are often brokenhearted is, first of all, because we live in a fallen world, and so everything is going to lead to brokenheartedness at some level or the other. But even beyond that, there often comes the realization not just that people don't live up to their ideals, but that they never really held them. You start to get to the point where you realize maybe the ideals that we held together as a group were just about group belonging. They didn't actually transcend the group. So when the group moves to a different place, a different set of ideals are then used. And a person can always find a reason to rationalize that. Our ideals have changed because the people we're opposing are so much worse, or the situation we're dealing with is so much worse. But the ideals then start to become part of group identity rather than what the group is moving toward. Someone can be tempted to put hope in the wrong place in almost everything short of Christ. And different people have different points of vulnerability. For some people, that's going to be politics. For some people, that's going to be a career. For some people, it's going to be love, finding the right soulmate. I mean, virtually anything can get that sense of hope, and we can trust in it in ways that are ultimately going to disappoint us. Hope is grown in community, just like humility, but often it's a community that one doesn't choose or hasn't chosen. I think, at least for me, what I want is stability. And what I would like is for things to stay more or less the same, but they don't. And often you have communities that seemed really, really strong that are fragmenting. And often what God is doing is creating a new community that one knows nothing about. I mean, that happens so often in Scripture. Peter is not looking for a community outside of his seafood industry community or his Jesus-following disciples community. God puts him with Cornelius. And I mean, that pattern happens over and over again. And often you will have people who are exhausted, they're finding hope, but they're finding hope by saying, how did we end up together? What did God do that this happened? And often what God does is to bring about those new communities through a kind of crisis that is not pleasant at the moment, and yet afterward nobody wants to go back to the way it was before. Often that happens not just in history, but it happens personally in a person's life. Jesus promised us he would be a shepherd to us individually and to the church. And what a shepherd does is when sheep start to veer off, comes along and pulls them back in. That's why Psalm 23, one of the most familiar passages for Christians and for others, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Why? Because I know that you're able to fight off my enemies, my real enemies, and also to put me back into line, to get me to those green pastures and still waters. And that's what he does. So in the life of a person, Jesus is going to be pulling you back in some way to your realizing, oh wait, I'm really not the sage here shaping and forming my own life. I'm a learner, a disciple. I have to look to him. He does the same thing with the church. Church repeatedly throughout history has thought, okay, well now we're here. And so now we can take on a different mentality. And Jesus comes along to say, no, you must take up your cross and follow me. When you think about that intersection of hope and humility, first thing that comes to my mind is the Apostle Peter on the boat, when Jesus is walking on the water and says, come out here to me. I mean, that's hope. Peter knows Jesus is there. I want to be with him. And he steps out into the water. The humility comes in when Peter takes his eyes off of Jesus and he starts to sink beneath the waves and cries out, Lord, help me. And he's pulled up. At the end of that, he realizes, I really can trust Jesus to go where he's going, that hope. And I can't do it on my own. I'm in need of Him. Those two things are held together that way.
You've had a chance to hear from David, Russell, and myself on the spiritual values of humility and hope. You've also had the chance to locate yourself on this quadrant and where you are on your pathway of growth to becoming a disciple. One of the great advantages of doing this course is we get to go on that pathway together. So stick with us and join us for the next session.
All right. Tell me what your impressions are at this point. Thinking, I mean, if we heard from Curtis Chang talking about being a cynic, and about from David French about being a combatant, and from Dave Russell Moore about being exhausted. I mean, how does this way of framing things help or not help you think about our politics and how we engage the politics around us? Do you think it's a good framing? I mean, is this a good way to frame this? I mean, can you see yourself applying this both to your life and to your relationships and interactions around the politics, the political world around us?
Yeah, for me, I think it's more descriptive than a pathway for me.
Mhm.
I see it as describing where we are or who we are and where we are on this spectrum. But I'm not sure that gives me a pathway to be engaging people in talking about politics. Maybe it
Yeah.
should. Right now, I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, no, we're still early. So you're absolutely right. I mean, this is giving us a framework within which we're going to work. And so, like, next week we're gonna see more and talk more about, I think, these kind of different positions. And I think our conversation will be around, all right, so if I find myself as a combatant, that tells me something about the way I engage others in the world and kind of these conversations. And then how does that then apply? Say I encounter a cynic. If I'm a combatant and I encounter a cynic, what do I know about how that interaction may go, and what do I need to grow in myself in order to be able to deal with that interaction more faithfully? What does it look like to move towards that disciple quadrant? So I think you're absolutely right, Skip. I think we're describing things. We're setting up this framework within which we're going to be able to think about how it applies then just to the way we interact. So I think you're not wrong at all, and don't lose hope. We're not even halfway through here yet. So give it a little bit of time for us to flesh that out. And I promise you that even if the curriculum doesn't do it to your satisfaction, we will do that as a group for sure, as we talk more in that last section for sure. Who else has something to say about this? Is this working for you?
We're applying this to politics, to this question just to politics.
Mm-hmm.
Then my experience have already taught me to teach politics always. Teach politics in ways that people will understand that they're being taught politics without them knowing they're being taught politics, right? Mm-hmm. Because my wisdom and my teaching is all that there's ways to include, right? Give you a perfect example real quick. I was talking with some more brothers this morning, 100 and so brothers we were talking, and the message was talking about the struggle. The struggle of this stuff is going to be hard, and nobody promised us a rose garden, struggle. So I said, well, the Lord said, well, his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And I said, so somewhere along the line, the Lord has said that if you follow what I'm doing, it should be easier and it should be lighter. Because he says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But you do it, but nobody backed it up. Every comment after that stayed on the struggle. Never acknowledged the same word of the relief of God, but stayed on the subject of the struggle, right? And so, like I say, the questions he's asking is like this: how do you combine me and we? Me and we. Take me and then what I say in my testimony, and how do you apply it to the we? Right? And then we all do that at a certain degree. How do I apply my own personal testimony to the bigger picture? Right? Or how was that applied and how was that interpreted? And that's all, like I said, all good to me. What he's saying makes sense because his humanness came through, right? His faults came through. He started talking about his faults and his humanity started showing, right? Which is good. So I liked what he was doing. I have no faults, no qualms about it. But like I said, I see where I can see the difference because I have experienced the difference.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Good. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Charles. All right. Well, a couple things jumped out at me that I just wanted to lift up before we move on to our last video for the evening. Then we'll talk again after that. But I loved when David in his segment talked about humility. He talked about Micah 6:8. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. And talked about when he engages somebody, and this starts to skip it, I think, how we do this. He goes backwards through those three things, right? That humility is, he enters the room, enters the conversation, the interaction with humility. Then kindness happens in the interaction, working towards what it looks like to get to a just place through that interaction. So walking through the humility and kindness to get to the justice. I thought that was interesting. And one of the things that Russell Moore said that I thought was interesting was that oftentimes new communities arise on the other side of a crisis. And the things that came to mind for me, kind of examples of this, like when you have a particular injury or illness, like I don't know how many times, and you've probably had the same experience, somebody who is going to have a knee replacement, for example. They never knew how many people around them had a knee replacement until they're going to have a knee replacement, right? And all of a sudden, all these people you connect with in ways that you hadn't connected before because something you have in common came up out of this crisis that you're having. Same thing for a cancer diagnosis, for example. How many people you all of a sudden connect with who have had that cancer journey to go through together. So health stuff was what jumped to mind for me, but it could happen just as easily through a political fight, or say you have something locally that comes up that you want to deal with in local politics, a project or something the government's going to do that you don't want them to do, and the people you connect with around that particular matter, right, that particular crisis that a new community forms through. I think that's an interesting thing, looking through the lens of this quadrant as to where that might go. All right, well, let's look. This is actually the first video of the third session of the 6 after party sessions, and we'll get into a bunch more next week. We'll watch this, then we'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll call it a night, and you can go watch your recording of the debate. All right, here we go.
As we get going on the after party, I think it's really helpful to give people a way to locate themselves, where they are relative to where we believe Jesus is calling them. And we gave them in the last session this 2x2 grid of hope and humility. And you can locate yourself. You could be predisposed to being combative on one quadrant. You could be predisposed to being cynical on another quadrant. And for a lot of people, I think, you can be predisposed to being exhausted.
And when you think about Jesus' call to discipleship, it's not, the way Jesus did this is not, okay, here are these 6 things, memorize them. It's come and see. Follow me. We're in burnout and we're pressing forward when the gospel shows us a very different way. I mean, Romans 12, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, and then through the renewing of your minds. So it really is possible to have that renewal and that rejuvenation of the way that you see the world and the way that you see each other. That's what I really like about these quadrants, is because it helps me to know, like, what do I need to work on, as opposed to what does he need to work on, or what does she need to work on.
There's the power of God that I want to learn more about. That's our hope. And that's why it begins with us.
You know, we all have sort of areas of that quadrant that we kind of naturally fall towards, and I fall towards the combative side of things. And one thing that is really clear from Scripture is that we are not to forsake the fight for justice. So there is a place for justice. It's a requirement that we pursue justice.
You think about in Paul's letters to Timothy, it's fight, fight, fight. Don't be timid. Don't neglect to stir up the flame that's within you. Be a good soldier of Christ. And then he says, treat everyone with gentleness and kindness. Why? That's not a break from the fighting.
Right.
He says that's how you fight, so that people can be turned to repentance, those who have been held captive by the devil, Paul says.
Gentleness is part of the fight.
Gentleness is part of the fight, and that's exactly right. I mean, the fruit of the Spirit, fruit of the Spirit are not sweet little things to crochet and hang on the wall. Fruit of the Spirit are the way that the Spirit invades the present order and actually brings all things under the feet of Christ. That is a way of fighting. It's not a break from it.
This leads us to where we're going with this session, which is, we're speaking to all people where they're at, but I think in some ways we're especially speaking to the person who tends towards the combative. Because what we want to present is, there actually is a combat. It actually, though, is a different combat than you may think is fighting. It's not what the world is telling you.
I want to talk a bit about what it's like to be the combatant. And I can imagine that there are some people in this room right now who are combatants. And here's a good way to tell if you are or are not a combatant. If you're in a conversation, if you're in a room and you hear someone being wrong, do you feel almost this visceral need to react? And the extreme level of this is when somebody is so online that, you know, it's like, hold on, I'll be at dinner soon. Someone's wrong on the internet and I have to set them straight. If there's someone wrong in your presence, or you believe they're wrong, and you begin to feel this urge, this need to weigh in, you might be a combatant. I'm describing myself. When I'm in a group conversation and someone brings up something in an area that I feel like I know something about, or I feel strongly or passionately about, I have a strong urge to engage, a very strong urge. Now, to be clear, engaging is not always the wrong call. I'm not saying, oh, combatants, stand down, because remember, act justly is a non-optional command for Christians. But what is our temptation as combatants? Our temptation as combatants is to focus on the justice to the exclusion of the kindness and the humility. That's our temptation. That's the double-edged sword. That's the other edge of our sword, is that neglecting of kindness and humility. And that's something that I have had to become aware of in my own life. And to really sort of temper that initial instinct that says, somebody's wrong, I've got to pounce, and I've got to pounce right now. To take that breath, to pause, to make sure to check myself. Is this something that's coming out of pride? Is this something that's coming out of arrogance? Have I listened to them fully? When I engage with them, how am I going to engage with them? These are the ways in which combatants should check themselves. And it's something that I've had to learn and relearn over the course of my life. You never get it fully and completely under control. And then the last thing is those times when you do fail, those times when you do have a moment where you're so aggressive that you actually start to hurt other people, to have the ability to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The partisan mind is essentially an identity marker. It's the way in which you would describe yourself. So, for example, if you ask me, who are you, David? I would say, I'm a Christian. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. I'm an American. And then some people would add on, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. Now, there's nothing at all wrong with being a member of a political party. But the real question is, how much of that is your identity? And so I was talking with somebody the other day, and they talked about how they're going to vote for one particular political party, no matter who the nominee is. And the explanation was, that's just who I am. In other words, it was a part of their identity in the same way that other things are also part of their identity. And that is what I suggest is quite dangerous when you become identified with a political party, so much so that it's essentially part of the descriptor of who you are. I think there's a very interesting relationship that exists between the partisan mind and combativeness. I look at the partisan mind as the rocket fuel for combativeness. Because when you have that partisan mind, it is part of your very identity. It is part of who you are to have these sets of ideas and to have this particular political affiliation. So you marry that mindset with a natural predisposition to combativeness, and you're going to see basically, in many ways, what the modern public square is. It's a bunch of people who are essentially acting as lawyers for their own political side. And what do lawyers do? Lawyers do, in their job, this is their job, if there's something negative about their side, like there's a failing or a flaw on their side, they'll either deny it or minimize it, shrink it, make it small. And if there's something good about their side, they'll magnify it, they'll blow it up to make it seem as if that's the dominant characteristic. This is what lawyers do. I've been in trials, and there's such a thing as bad facts. And so one of the things that you try to do when you're a lawyer for your client is to make those bad facts manageable and make the good facts the dominant facts in the jury's mind. Now, this all works in an adversarial legal system where the rules of evidence come into play. That's how we achieve justice. It is a lot harder for it to work like that in just the general public square, where there are no rules of evidence, there are no rules of ethics. It is a free-for-all. And I don't know if you've ever seen like a bunch of litigators be given a free-for-all set of rules. It can get ugly fast. Litigators work within a set of rules that moderate our worst instincts. The public square does not have those rules. And so what ends up happening is each of the partisan lawyers for their side are often tempted to indulge their worst instincts, where it goes from not just minimizing negative facts, but denying them outright. Not just acknowledging that your opponent has flaws, but blowing up those flaws all out of proportion to their actual sin. And that's a form of bearing false witness. That is not telling the truth about either your own side or the other side. It is a process of minimization and exaggeration. And once you see that process in play in political discourse, you can't unsee it. It is everywhere. And it's really important to know you're not learning when you're litigating. So what we're dealing with right now is just this fundamental us versus them dichotomy. If you're one of us, we've got your back. we will cover your flaws. We won't even acknowledge your flaws. If you're them, we won't acknowledge your virtues. We won't appreciate your virtues. All you are is flaws, because what we have to do is defeat you. And that is the fundamental polarizing dynamic of our politics. If you're in the category of us, you're fundamentally good. Your flaws are manageable. You deserve a defense. If you're category of them, you're fundamentally bad. Your flaws are dangerous, perhaps even catastrophically dangerous. And you know what? Your virtues aren't even worth mentioning. In fact, if we mention your virtues, that's bad because it might undermine our dedication to taking you on. If we humanize you, it undermines the commitment to destroy you. And if we acknowledge the flaws of our own side, it undermines our sense of loyalty. And so you can see how it drives us inexorably towards division, towards hatred, and ultimately towards violence. I would describe the us versus them divide in the United States with 3 words: gut-level hatred. And I use those words advisedly. I'm actually quoting a piece in the New York Times written by one of my colleagues who was describing the end result of an enormous amount of research around how do Americans feel about each other? How do Americans feel about their political opponents? And when you dive into that research, it is scary how negative and how hateful people are to each other. There's even a term called lethal mass partisanship. And what lethal mass partisanship means is there's a percentage of Americans, roughly in the 20% range, who actually believe the world would be better off if a significant numbers of the opposing party died. Not that they want to kill them, but the world would be better off if a significant number of the opposing party died. That's lethal mass partisanship. And you might have a glass half full perspective and say, well, only 20% of Americans feel that way. But that's 60 million people. That's 40 plus million adults with that view of their fellow man. That's stunning. And even if you back way away from that kind of sheer malice, you see Republicans and Democrats have almost mirror image negative views of each other. It's not like one side or the other is far more tolerant of each other's point of view. No, both Republicans and Democrats view the other side as brainwashed, as bigoted, as prejudiced, you name it. This sort of view of we're on one side not because we like our own side, but because we dislike the other. And it has been rising and rising steadily since the 1990s, to the point where overwhelming majorities of Republicans and overwhelming majorities of Democrats have extremely hostile views of people on the other side. And there's even some indication that people are more open to someone marrying a person of a different faith than they are marrying a person of a different political party. And that would tell you what's the true religion. You see this constantly in the rhetoric. We are patriots. They are Marxists. We are tolerant. They are fascist. Note how dramatic that language is. Patriot versus Marxist, tolerant versus fascist. It's not just wrong. You're claiming your opponents are wrong on a world historic scale, on the scale of Marxism, on the scale of fascism. Yet this is extremely common rhetoric. In Christian circles, you'll even hear the term demonic, that we are godly, they are demonic. And so their flaws aren't just simple mistakes. And so that level of rhetoric ratchets up the stakes. It doesn't just ratchet up the stakes. In many ways, it dehumanizes. It inhibits the ability to show kindness and humility. What reason is there to be humble in front of a fascist or a Marxist? What do they have to teach me? This kind of extreme rhetoric absolutely inhibits our ability to express the virtues that God calls us to express. The partisan mind inflicts grave damage on your neighbors, and it inflicts grave damage on yourself. So the way it damages your neighbors is easy and obvious to state. It makes you, in many ways, their adversary. It treats them as an adversary. Their loss becomes your gain. One of the things that invariably happens when you adopt that mindset is you magnify your own righteousness. It armors you against the humble and repentant heart that you should possess each and every day. Because if you have an humble and repentant heart, if you acknowledge your flaws, aren't you giving your enemy an opening? And you can never give your enemy an opening. And so what you're doing is you're building up in yourself a high degree of tolerance for your own sin. And you're inflicting on others a very low degree of tolerance and zero grace and no mercy for their flaws. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see how that hurts them and how it hurts you.
All right. So let's talk for a few minutes before we call it a night tonight. What did you think of this description of the partisan mind and kind of how far it can take us down the road away from one another?
He was totally partisan. He was both sidesism. He delved into something that is totally is just as dangerous. And that is he tried to paint both political parties as being both the same, with the same ideals, the same outlook, and the same. I've heard that kind of rhetoric. That's why I say for me, I have to separate the me story from the truth. When he talked about justice, then justice justice is just that. I think the Lord said you're supposed to preach truth in season and out of season. It's how you preach the truth and how you tell the truth. And that's why I say my experience and my walk and my understanding tells me when I'm hearing me stories and me testimony and how I see it. And how you know that? Because all you hear is this both sidesism, and you don't hear some Christians, some folks may believe like this. Some Christians believe like that. But when you paint all of us and everybody and the whole religion as being as the way you see it, then you're off balance. Not that you're wrong, but you're off balance. And like I say, that's why, you got to, at least for me, I have to understand and separate the me from the we. And when we got this last thing, was all of him.
Okay. Well, I think, yeah. Well, Charles, I think I hear what you're saying. Part of what he shared was that and what we've seen, especially the last few years, is as we've got so much polling data that we do see these kind of attitudes across the spectrum. And so I think you're right. It's important to not slide easily into both sidesism, but it's important for us to recognize that I think it's part of the humility thing to say that across that political spectrum, people can lack humility and can be combatants, either as radical left or radical right, and that we've got to be careful about both sides, but also painting the other side.
What President Biden has been saying for the last 4 years is totally different from what 45 has been saying for the last 4 years.
Charles,
right?
remember,
so I'm just saying.
we're not going to talk. We're not going to talk partisan politics.
I'm not. I'm just saying how we got here. Like he said, if we're going to talk about the how, then talk about in the how is the truth. And for the last 4 years, President Biden has not been talking the way last 45 has been talking when he tries to make both sides.
But Charles, I'd rather we not talk about specific politicians in this. Okay, I think that's important for us to not do that. We're doing something else in these conversations. So I appreciate the passion. I really do. All right. What about somebody else? What did you hear that struck you? Either something that, like Charles, was problematic, or something that struck you as describing the situation we find ourselves in?
Sorry, I'm finding it a problem.
Yeah, what are you finding? Yeah, talk to us. Talk to us.
It's don't agree.
You call in, she says, no, it was reading
Yeah, but with what? What do you not agree
we don't
with?
even use a building and went up.
The majority of what they said. And I agree with Charles, so
Okay.
yeah.
So, all right. All right.
Yeah,
So,
I don't agree with them.
okay.
It's
So
not
you don't-
bipartisan. It's not biblical. I just don't agree.
Okay. All right.
It's been normal forever.
Good.
So
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. I would urge us all. I think this is useful. I would urge all of us to take a step back and to look if we are feeling that way, to take another look at the other end of that spectrum. And one of the things that they said early on in one of these videos today, one of them suggested that we need to step back and look at our opponents, our political opponents, in a position that they're taking, and we need to be able to state their position in a way that they would respect and appreciate the way we're stating it. I think very few of us do that. We take our position and fight for that. That's where the combatant comes out, right? That we are right, they are wrong, and that's part of what David was talking about. Tens of millions of our neighbors in this country are seeing the virtue of using violence to get rid of the people who hold the opposite position, rather than stepping into their shoes and trying to figure out how do we really understand one another. So that I think is an interesting challenge for us, all of us. Who else has something you share about what we heard here tonight? I've got a few other notes here if we don't. One of the phrases David used is, "You're not learning if you're litigating." I thought that was pretty powerful. If our focus is on the combat, on defending our position rather than learning, we're not learning. We're just fighting. It's like so often in our conversations with one another, we're not really listening to the other person. We're in our head, we're rehearsing our response to them rather than really listening and letting what they have to say impact how we would respond or reply to it. Anybody else have a thought? All right, let's see what else we got here. I think, and then this is getting to your homework for this week, since we just got a few minutes left here, and maybe this will move us somewhere. So a few things that you might do this week to try to relate what we've heard tonight to your everyday life and how you engage these matters. Sorry, I was writing my notes here. I want to make sure I say this right. Okay, so one is that question. So pick a position that somebody has opposite of yours, whether it's a friend or a pundit on your favorite news channel, or a social media thing, or a podcast that you listen to or don't want to listen to. Somebody who's got the diametrically opposed position on an issue to you, and see if you can articulate their position in a convincing way. That's again, that's a measure of how we're truly participating in relating to each other. Another way to do that is to pay attention to all those different places that you engage the world: TV, social media, your neighbors, your coworkers, and look for combatants, since that's the quadrant that we've been focusing on the last half hour. Look at the combatants, find a combatant, and think about why you would describe them that way. What is it about that person that brings that up for you, makes you think that they would be in that in that square. And remember, the combatant square is the low humility, high hope fourth of that quadrant. And finally, look at yourself through the lens of the quadrant and your position in that quadrant, which of the four you self-describe as, and just pick one moment or one engagement in your week. You might do this before you go to bed at night. Think about, did I have an engagement or encounter this day that I really would like to reflect on through the lens of this quadrant, and reflect on how you played to type. So for me as a cynic, I need to find a moment, an engagement or an encounter with somebody, something that I watched, or my reaction to something that I saw on TV or the internet, and reflect on that and how I was a cynic in that moment. How was my hope low? How was my humility low in that moment? Because that self-reflection is one of the first steps to us really being able to engage and to build those relational practices with people rather than political reactivity. Okay. All right. And finally, just for tonight, if you're going to watch the debate, if you haven't already been watching it, look for moments in the debate that reflect some of this. Winner, do you see moments where people are kind, either Harris or Trump are kind, moments where they are humble, moments where they are reaching for justice? Use Micah 8 as the lens that you look through, because this is, I tell you, one of my goals in doing this at all this month is for us to take a step off of that political left-right spectrum onto Jesus's level. That's our goal as disciples of Jesus Christ. If we are stuck on that left-right, red-blue, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal spectrum, we are not on Jesus's spectrum. We're not there. And we got to get there, and then we can view the other through that lens. But it's so important for us in our discipleship journey to make that step. So, all right, we are at 8 o'clock, and you all are great. Thank you so much. We'll have a few people back next week who told me they had specific conflicts tonight. I hope you all have a great week and begin to see the world through Jesus's eyes. That'll be good. So let me close this with prayer, and then we'll shut her down. Gracious God, we thank you. Thank you for this day and for this time to gather this evening. We pray that you would continue to transform our hearts, renew our minds through the hard work of getting in line with your Spirit, with your Son, with you. Bless us as we go forward. Help us to have hope and humility in each and every step of our journey with you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, everybody, unmute and say goodnight to each other, and then we'll call it a night.
Good night. Thanks,
Good night,
Chris.
y'all. Good night.
All right,
everybody.
bye-bye.
Good night.